Trump has a plan for the Ukraine war, and it's a plan that may come with some surprising benefits, not only for Ukraine, but for the United States as well. Here we dive into what we know so far about Trump's plans and what they'll mean for Ukraine, the US, and Russia. We start with a key question. Why is Donald Trump so intent on ending the Ukraine war quickly? On the surface, the answer may appear obvious. Ending the Ukraine war would help bring peace to Europe and allow the US to quell Russian President Vladimir Putin's expansionist desires. Hundreds of thousands of lives would be saved, not to mention billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine. That's the combined humanitarian and financial view of the peace plan, perhaps, but the real reasons Trump is so intent on peace run a little deeper. First, we need to consider that Trump has come to power in part because he appeals to a large US isolationist base. Foreign Affairs highlighted this in a September 2024 article in which it claimed that internationalists, both at home and abroad, worried about Trump becoming president again. They fear that Trump will take steps to dismantle the liberal order that the United States and its allies have built and defended since World War II. Though melodramatic, the statement does hint at the possibility of Trump choosing to limit America's involvement in NATO, for example. After all, Trump has raised the possibility of leaving the collective defense organization before. However, those claims were made more in response to America's NATO partners failing to pay their way, rather than any true desire to leave the group. As Trump said in March 2024, the US would 100% remain in NATO, as long as the group's other nations play fair. In other words, spend more of your gross domestic product, or GDP, on defense, just as the United States does. Many NATO members have responded by upping their spending. The BBC reports that NATO expects 23 of its 32 members to hit its recommended target of spending at least 2% of GDP on defense in 2024. That's a massive improvement over 2023, when just 11 of NATO's member nations hit the target. So it's clear that Trump's words have had an impact, helping the rest of Europe to see how deep the threat Russia poses to Europe truly runs, and there's likely little threat of Trump pushing the US out of NATO. Still, there's no denying that Trump appeals to isolationist conservatives, which brings us back to his peace plan. In July 2024, the Pew Research Center demonstrated that there was almost an even split between Republicans and Democrats regarding how much aid the US should provide to Ukraine. It found that a slim majority of 49% believe that the United States doesn't have a responsibility to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. Republicans tended to agree with this viewpoint more than Democrats, with 62% of the former saying that the US shouldn't be helping Ukraine, compared to 38% of the latter. There's a clear sentiment being expressed here. Many of Trump's supporters think the US doesn't have a responsibility to help Ukraine. So one of the reasons Trump is so adamant about enforcing his peace plan is that it provides a route out of the Ukraine conflict for the US. Ending the war would mean reducing the chances of the US having to get directly involved, in addition to potentially minimizing the amount of military aid it's providing to Ukraine. That will play well with the president-elect's base, as well as serving the desires of a slim majority within the US. However, isolating the US is far from the only reason Trump wants to create a peace plan, and most likely not the main reason. In April 2024, former Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, both of whom served in the National Security Council during Trump's first presidential term, wrote a research paper for the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI. Though the AFPI isn't a bipartisan organization, the paper it published revealed some insights into how Trump and his incoming administration may be thinking about the war. And through that insight comes some more reasons why Trump wants to push his peace plan through. First, Kellogg and Fleitz believe that President Joe Biden's decision during the early stages of Putin's special military operation doomed Ukraine from the start. It specifically focuses on the Ukrainian counteroffensive launched in the fall of 2022, which failed to reclaim the territory Ukraine lost in the first few months of the invasion. Ukraine's counteroffensive ran out of steam by the fall of 2022 because the United States and its allies failed to provide the country with the weapons it needed to continue the fight to reclaim its territory, the paper claims. It also notes that America lacks any sort of defense treaty with Ukraine and has constantly placed limits on how Ukraine can use the weapons it provides. While the paper says Biden was correct in keeping American troops out of Ukraine, it criticizes the outgoing president for not doing enough to help during the war's early stages. As a result, Putin was able to bed his troops into Ukraine and create the meat grinder war we see today. The US, the paper argues, acted too little and too late, creating an unwinnable situation for Ukraine. It even suggests that President Biden was prepared to give up on the prospect of saving Ukraine, instead offering Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky safe passage out of Kyiv. Zelensky refused that offer. Ukraine kept on fighting. The point here is that the AFPI believes the US missed its chance to nip the war in the bud during its early stages. Now it's too late. Russia has welcomed over 10,000 North Korean soldiers into its country, which are now part of a 50,000-strong counteroffensive in Kursk. It's also amended its nuclear doctrine so that it can strike against any nation that attacks Russia on its own territory with the backing of a nuclear-armed nation, such as the United States. These types of escalations serve as a primary reason why Trump wants to introduce a peace plan. To the incoming president, the Ukraine war may be a hopeless cause for America's ally because Putin has been allowed to escalate to a point where Ukraine can no longer fight him off. It may take several more years, but a Russian victory may appear inevitable in the Trump camp. Much better to arrange peace now than to do so when Ukraine is further weakened, may be Trump's logic. Speaking of North Korea, Russia's growing alliance with one of the world's biggest pariahs is another concern to Trump and his camp. As the AFPI points out, a prolonged war in Ukraine also risks deepening the alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, which has been strengthened by the conflict. The report isn't wrong. All three of those countries have developed stronger ties with Russia as a result of the Ukraine war, with North Korea being a particular winner. In June 2024, it signed a cooperative defense pact with Russia that guarantees each country will come to the other's aid if one is ever under attack. Russia has already put that pact to good use by transporting the previously mentioned 10,000 North Korean soldiers into Russia. And beyond that official pact, North Korea has also sent at least 8 million artillery shells to Russia to allow Putin to continue his constant bombardments of Ukrainian fortifications and cities. Iran and China, though not having signed any cooperative defense pacts with Russia, have also seen their ties to Putin strengthen. All three countries took part in joint naval drills in March 2024. A month before the AFPI paper's publication, and both Iran and China are supplying Russia in different ways. The Arms Control Association says Iran agreed to a deal with Russia to send hundreds of missiles Putin's way in October 2023. Those missiles would add to the 3,000 Shahid drones Russia has received from Iran. China is also believed to have started supplying weapons to Russia as of September 2024, amidst the appearance of what one Western official called clear evidence when speaking to Sky News. Even without weapons, China has served as a great outlet for Russian oil that Putin can no longer sell in Europe. It's also provided the Russian state with dual-use components that Russia can use to keep its weapons in good condition or build more, without China directly offering lethal armaments itself. There are now even suggestions that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are uniting to become a new axis of evil akin to that formed by Germany, Japan, and Italy during the Second World War. Dubbed CRINK, this new axis is anti-West and would allow all four nations to strengthen each other against the United States. The America First report claims that a hostile policy towards Russia not only needlessly made it an enemy of the United States, but it also drove Russia into the arms of China, which led to the development of this axis. Trump's peace plan may not be capable of eliminating the new axis of evil, but he'll hope that brokering peace between Ukraine and Russia can also soften relations between the US and Putin's regime, thus minimizing the impact CRINK has on the world going forward. Tackling the CRINK alliance is high on Trump's agenda, not least because the US may be running out of its ammunition stockpiles, the fourth reason why Trump is pushing for a Ukraine peace plan. The AFPI report points out that the US sent around $113 billion to Ukraine during the first 2 years of the war, with a further $61 billion committed in April 2024. Most of that money came in the form of military assistance. That's created a stockpile problem, according to the report. It uses Stinger missiles as a key example. The US has sent 2,000 of those missiles to Ukraine, with current rates of production meaning it will take America 13 years to claw back that lost stock. The US has also sent over 2 million 155mm artillery rounds to Ukraine, despite having a production schedule that used to run at 14,000 shells made per month. Some action is already being taken on that front. A foreign policy report from March 2024 notes that the US Defense Industrial Base has more than doubled its artillery shell production. In 2024, it'll build 30,000 artillery shells per month, then 50,000 by September, and hopefully raise this to 100,000 per month by the end of 2025. Still, it's clear there's a stockpiling issue in the US. The AFPI report's authors aren't the only people to point out this ammunition problem. Foreign Policy says the Defense Department asked for $1.2 billion less for conventional precision-guided munition production for 2025. It accuses the Pentagon of kicking the can down the road, with promises it'll buy more munitions next year. That may not be soon enough for Trump, given how much of a drain the Ukraine war has been on America's military resources, especially when Trump looks set to make relations between the US and China tenser with the introduction of more tariffs. Trump is expected to ramp up the already hefty tariffs the US places on many Chinese products, with Reuters reporting that those tariffs may go as high as 40% in 2025. The problem here is that decisions like this make relationships between the US and China fraught, and with China potentially planning to invade Taiwan at some point in the next couple of years, America's stockpile problem is cast into an even harsher light. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies says, America's industrial base isn't prepared for a conflict with China, especially if the Ukraine war carries on. It doesn't have adequate surge capacity to produce new weapons, and it's possible that conflict between the US and China would wipe out significant portions of the US and Chinese militaries. Trump has to keep China in mind when making decisions about the war. With America's ammunition stockpiles dwindling, he'll push for peace because doing so means the US can finally stop sending so many weapons to Ukraine. That would allow it to refill its stockpiles so it's prepared for war elsewhere. So we have our reasons for the Ukraine peace plan: appealing to increasing isolationism in the voter base, slowing the rise of CRINK, replenishing ammunition stockpiles, and ending support for a war that some believe Ukraine can't win is all on Trump's mind. But what about the plan itself? It's here where details start to get a little hazy. Donald Trump has been tight-lipped about his plan to broker peace in Ukraine, leaving commentators to speculate on what his ideas may be. However, the prevailing theory is that Trump would look to create a peaceful settlement in which Russia, and potentially Ukraine, would keep what they've taken in the war so far, and then be separated by a demilitarized zone. It's somewhat similar to the concept to the zone that separates North and South Korea, with that zone also being patrolled by NATO soldiers to ensure neither side tries to break through. Trump's Vice President J.D. Vance lent credence to these rumors during a September 2024 interview on The Sean Ryan Show. The New York Times quotes Vance as saying that Trump would sit down with leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe, saying, "You guys need to figure out what a peaceful settlement looks like." Trump's vice president then outlined a potential plan in which Russia would retain the land it's claimed in Ukraine so far before the establishment of a demilitarized zone across the current front lines. Presumably, this would also mean that Ukraine retains the territory it's captured in Kursk, assuming it still has it by the time the peace talks start. Ukraine's side would then be heavily fortified to guard it against future Russian invasion, Vance claims. Ukraine would also have to make concessions in this plan. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join some of these sort of allied institutions, Vance told Ryan. I think that's ultimately what this looks like. The Economic Times followed up on this potential plan with a report in November 2024. It says the buffer zone would be about 800 miles long, covering the current length of the front line, and would be patrolled by a combination of European and British troops. These soldiers would act in neutral capacity, showing favor to neither Russia nor Ukraine. Interestingly, there's no mention of American soldiers being sent to the buffer zone. The US might provide training and other support, but it won't make any contribution to troop numbers. As one Trump camp member put it, "We're not sending American men and women to uphold peace in Ukraine, and we're not paying for it. Get the Poles, Germans, British, and French to do it." However, the United States would commit to bolstering Ukraine's defensive capabilities under Trump's plan, according to the Economic Times, though at the price of Ukraine postponing its ambitions to join NATO for 2 decades. That's likely because Trump is wary of a second Russian invasion triggering Article 5 of the NATO Charter if Ukraine does become a member of the organization. Furthermore, Trump is wary of escalating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and Russia's conflict with the US any further. Allowing Ukraine to join NATO might be seen as an escalatory move, given that the implication would be that the organization's 32 member nations would more directly come to Ukraine's aid in the event of a second invasion. In short, Trump wants to broker a peace that minimizes the threat of the West, the US in particular, being pulled into World War III. The good news for Ukraine in this plan is that Trump isn't saying that Ukraine could never join NATO. Yes, it would have to wait at least 20 years, but NATO membership in the future is on the table. Perhaps the 20-year wait is designed to ensure NATO membership doesn't lead to an immediate resumption of hostilities. As macabre as it might be to say, Trump may also be considering the likelihood that the 72-year-old Putin will have died by the end of that 20 years, with whoever succeeds him perhaps being friendlier to Ukraine. While this peace plan may look solid on the surface, there are issues on both sides to consider. For Ukraine, Trump's proposal, assuming Vance has given us an accurate depiction of the plan, would mean that it's forced into giving up 20% of its territory that Russia occupies right now. That would mean the loss of large parts of the Donbass, Mariupol, Kherson, and Luhansk, among other regions. Ukraine also will have failed to regain Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Kursk could also be a sticking point. Ukraine captured around 450 square miles of Kursk in the early weeks of its counter-invasion into Russian territory in August 2024. It's currently fighting tooth and nail to retain as much of that territory as possible, as Putin has sent a 50,000-strong counter-offensive to take the land back. Assuming Ukraine can hold on until Trump starts peace negotiations, would Putin be open to giving up Kursk in return for the 20% of Ukraine that he's captured? It seems unlikely. Ukraine would also be loath to give up territory that it's fought so hard to defend, but in that instance, Trump at least has some leverage. He could threaten to end, or at least significantly reduce, the amount of aid the United States sends to Ukraine, if it refuses to broker his version of peace. Losing America's support would make it incredibly difficult for Ukraine to continue fighting the war, which would leave Zelensky with a difficult choice. Keep fighting to an almost inevitable loss, as the AFPI predicts, or hand over some of Ukraine's territory to Putin in exchange for retaining the 80% he still holds. As for Russia, it's still not clear how Putin will react to this version of Trump's peace plan. He certainly claimed that he's open to a ceasefire. In November 2024, Newsweek reported that he's willing to enter terms, though he will stand firm on several critical conditions. One of these conditions is that Ukraine abandons its attempts to gain NATO membership. Trump's plan would cover that, at least for 20 years, which may be enough for Putin if he's focused more on his personal legacy than the future of Ukraine and Russia after he's gone. The second condition is that Putin would rule out making any significant concessions to Ukraine. That could be a sticking point if the demilitarized front line Trump proposes includes Kursk. As we've mentioned, it's unlikely that Putin would want to hand any part of the Russian Federation over to Ukraine. So Putin may negotiate to regain the territory Ukraine has claimed in Kursk while keeping what he's claimed in Ukraine so far. Therein lies another sticking point. How much of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia does Putin want? Russia has asserted that it wants to integrate all 4 regions entirely into the Russian Federation. The problem is that for all Putin's efforts during 2024, Russia only controls between 70 and 80% of the territory of those regions combined. Ukraine still holds under 10,000 square miles across all 4 regions, which Putin may want to feed into his maximalist agenda. Relinquishing the territory he's yet to capture but wants to make part of Russia may be a concession too far for a Russian president who's barely willing to make any. However, there's a chance that Putin would relent. Newsweek notes that its information comes from a quintet of existing and former Russian officials, 3 of whom say Putin might negotiate. The specific divisions of these 4 regions could come under the microscope, with Putin perhaps being flexible. Ukraine offering Kursk in return for keeping the 10,000 square miles Russia has yet to take could be enough. Putin would get to claim a significant Russian victory, both in terms of defending his country and taking a large portion of Ukraine through his special military operation. So the success of Trump's peace plan may come down to whether Putin wants total annexation of these 4 regions and if Ukraine is willing to give them up if he does. After listening to all of this, you may start to believe that Trump's plan is surprisingly Putin-friendly. It's somewhat similar to the peace plan Putin claims he proposed shortly after launching his invasion. According to Chatham House, that plan would have seen Russia cement its territorial gains in Ukraine back in 2022, akin to Trump's proposal now. But that plan came with other caveats, including Ukraine limiting the size and strength of its military and assuming a position of permanent neutrality in return for Moscow's security guarantees. In other words, Ukraine would have to weaken itself forever to ensure Russia doesn't invade again. Trump's plan incorporates the territorial issues and a potential NATO concession that would ensure neutrality. However, the addition of a demilitarized zone and an American commitment to fortifying Ukraine runs counter to what Putin likely really wanted in his proposed 2022 peace plan, a chance to regroup and arrange a secondary invasion later. It's also important to point out that Trump is far from Russia-friendly. For instance, he approved the provision of lethal arms, including rocket launchers, rifles, and Javelin missiles, to Ukraine during his first stint as president in the wake of Russia's Crimea annexation. Those weapons proved exceptionally useful to Ukraine during the early stages of Putin's special military operation. He also provided a $250 million assistance package including night vision gear, medical equipment, and radar systems, albeit after freezing and unfreezing the package amidst political wrangling. Trump was also the leading voice against the development of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, going so far as to approve sanctions on any company that assisted Russian gas giant Gazprom on the pipeline. He argued that the 764-mile pipeline would turn Germany into a hostage of Russia at the time. Though that pipeline eventually received US approval several years later, Trump's opposition shows that he's far from a man who'll kowtow to Putin. His approval of an airstrike against Russian mercenaries operating in Syria in 2018 is further proof. Trump's strike killed between 200 and 300 Russian mercenary fighters. Given how prevalent these types of mercenary groups have proven to be in the Ukraine war, you could reasonably say that any strike against them is a strike against Russia itself, and Trump approved such a strike. So Trump's peace plan may seem like it's making concessions to Russia in Ukraine, but the reality, at least from the Trump camp's perspective, is that the plan is the only way out of providing never-ending support to a war that it believes Ukraine can no longer win. The plan will save Ukraine from further harm and the gradual loss of its territory, Trump believes. It will also do away with the risk of Western powers having to become direct combatants themselves. Trump would argue he isn't making concessions with his plan. He'd say he's ending a protracted stalemate that's costing thousands of lives on both sides of the conflict. But what do you think about Trump's Ukraine peace plan? Will it end up resembling what J.D. Vance implied it would look like during his interview with Sean Ryan? Would Zelensky and Putin be willing to agree a peace that sees Ukraine lose territory and Russia fail to claim as much as it would have liked? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.